Welcome to the Blue Talk with David McDonald, professor at the Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Canada and director of the Municipal Services Project, a global research network that explores progressive forms of public services with a focus on equity, sustainability, and democratic engagement. Welcome to this first Blue Talk. David, you're a Blue Community Ambassador. You promote water as a public good under public control. In your publications, you call it public water. Can you explain this to us?
Well, why do I support public water, or what do I mean by public water?
Well, maybe a bit of both.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the first one. I spent the first half of my career, well, probably less than that now, being critical of privatization. And not just in water services, but in healthcare, transportation, electricity, waste management, across a wide swath of what I consider to be core essential public services. And it was very clear to me and remains clear to me that bringing in for-profit private companies to provide such important essential services is almost inevitably problematic. There are cases where the private sector has done and can do a good job, but the profit motive and the challenges associated with managing third-party contractors, questions around transparency related to contract arrangements, the list goes on and on and on around why handing the operation and or ownership of essential public services to the private sector is deeply problematic. So the next question for me was, okay, and I say we collectively because it's part of a much larger team of researchers with my Municipal Services Project that I've worked with over the last 2.5 decades. We started to ask ourselves, okay, we know what we don't like, what do we like? And just because something is public, and I'll come back to that word in a moment, just because something's publicly owned and operated doesn't mean it's good. It's very easy to find poorly run public services, inefficient, unaccountable, uneven, non-sustainable, the list goes on and on again. So I'm not necessarily in favor of something being public simply because it's publicly owned and operated. I'm interested in public services that are accountable, that are transparent, that are oriented towards sustainability and equity, etc. So we've worked over the years to come up with a list of kind of normative criteria, like the ones I've just listed: accountability and transparency and sustainability and equity orientation, etc., that we assess public services on and say, okay, are these the kinds of public services that we support? And so it's not necessarily an either or. I'm either for public or against private. It's really about what kind of public service are we wanting to support, and how do we understand the way that it works, and perhaps most importantly, to what extent are these things transferable and or suitable to other locations? So what might be considered a good public service in one place may not be the same in another place. And I'll use the example of participatory decision making. In some parts of the world, Latin America, most notably perhaps in the water sector, but it's certainly not constrained to Latin America, there's a lot of demand amongst citizens for an opportunity to have a say in the way that water services are run. And even direct participation in operating the service or making policy decisions on the service, etc. That's not necessarily something that people want or are even interested in doing in other parts of the world. They're happy if they turn on the tap and safe, reliable, affordable, sustainable water comes out. They don't necessarily feel the need to be deeply engaged in it. And so, you can have a high score for participatory decision making as a public utility in one place and a low score in another, but it doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other. What you do want is relatively high scores on a wide range of issues. So, if a public utility fails on accountability and transparency and efficiency and sustainability, et cetera, then you've really got a problematic public utility. But as a colleague of mine likes to say, there is no chemically pure public service. Nothing is going to be perfect in all respects. And what works in one place or is in demand in one place might not necessarily be what people want in another place. So it's one of those things where you know what it is, but when you like a public service, but it's also complicated and requires, I think, very careful qualitative and quantitative analysis to determine whether or not this is a kind of a public service that you want to celebrate or to try and reproduce. So we've spent a lot of time looking at different case studies and comparing case studies to try and draw out those comparative elements. And that I think does two things. One, it shows that A, there is no perfect form of public. But B, there's lots of lessons that can be learned across place and time. We've looked historically at the way public service has been run as well, and are there lessons to be learned from the way things were done 100 years ago? For example. So, anyways, a complicated answer to your question, but and then, the other question you may want to get to, but I'll stop talking in a moment, is the question of ownership and whether, corporatization versus other forms of public ownership are meaningful.
Right. Before going back to the public discussion about public water, let's go back for a moment to the private issue. The World Bank and other big players, international institutions, they permanently call for private investment to fill the financial gap to provide water and sanitation. What do you make out of this?
They they do slightly shift in the way that they make these calls. So they're less and less calling for outright ownership of water utilities, in part, well, mostly because there are very few private water companies that want to own infrastructure these days. So it's more about public-private partnerships and increasingly long-term contracts to manage particular aspects of a water service. And that's largely because it's just so risky that private companies, particularly in low-income countries or in low-income communities, and that can be places like low-income neighborhoods of Detroit in the United States. Uh, Private companies are really not interested. It's just far too risky, both financially and politically, a venture. So increasingly, the World Bank has called for, blended financing, de-risking of investments, et cetera. So it's not a call for privatization per se, if we define that as the ownership of the assets of a water and sanitation company. It's more continuing to push for ways to bring the private sector in, and particularly to bring in private finance. And this is something the World Bank just cannot seem to let go of, despite the fact that its own research has consistently demonstrated that even when it comes to simply financing water services, private financial institutions just aren't interested. And for the same reason, it's risky financially and it's risky politically. And the turnaround times can be decades, as opposed to years or even months, or in some cases days for more speculative finance. Um, Nevertheless, we continue to see in some forms of commercialization and privatization and increasingly financialization of our water services. So I think the most insidious thing the World Bank has done of late is pushing for I know they don't use the language around financialization of water, but promoting investment by non-traditional financial institutions in the water sector. Um, and venture capital and so on, where it's not even companies that specialize in water services, it's just pure financial companies that are willing to take a risk. And we do see that happening in countries in the global north and in other areas where there's less risk associated with it, where the return on investment is more secure. And so that is an ongoing threat to the sustainability and accountability, et cetera, of water services. But it's less and less about particular companies like Suez and Veolia as it is more about financing companies and financing mechanisms which are undermining public ownership and accountability.
You said at the beginning that public ownership is not per se good or bad, and arguing for water and sanitation as a human right and a public service. Where do you see, if ever, do you see a role for the private companies and private money? Where do you see that? Or should things be kept complete? Should they be kept completely out of these services? Or how can they play a positive role?
Well, it's important, I think, to separate out the ownership and management of water from ongoing activities around supplying pipes and water technology and so on. In those areas, private companies are very, very heavily involved. And I don't know that we're ever going to see or even want to see public provision of, let's say, I don't know, chlorine supplies in the water system. And that's really just a matter of scale that, no individual municipality has the capacity to, for example, build its own new sewage treatment plant. You're going to have to bring in a private construction company to do that kind of work. Perhaps some of the largest municipalities in the world have that kind of capacity, but for the most part, most municipalities are going to contract out the construction and some of the maintenance of water and sewage services that are specialized, and some of the technologies that are constantly being developed. So private companies do play a huge role in our water services. But they're not, my concern about it is that they should not be owning or managing on a daily basis water provision. So I think it's important to make that distinction. Now, there are places and times where the state, municipal or otherwise, is simply too corrupt, too incompetent, or just simply non-existent in many rural parts of Africa, for example, um, and calling for public water is not necessarily the direction you want to be going. Are there cases like that where you could have a private company come in and provide water? In theory, but it gets back to my earlier point, is it's just too risky. And so you're going to either have to give these companies such enormous profit guarantees or other subsidies to make them entice them to do this kind of thing, that you just have to ask yourself, well, why don't we then just figure out a way to make this work publicly? So, I think in theory, there are times where you could have public management and potentially even ownership of water services. And there are cases where they have done it well. But I think the counterpoint is, well, if it's easy enough for a private company to do it, why can't a public company do it? it's not rocket science. We basically have been doing water the same way for 150 years. You pull it out of the ground or take it from a river, you treat it and you pump it to people's homes. Um, and so, how can we build the public capacity and the public finances to make sure these things are kept in public hands?
If I get you right, you would also say, so whenever we have private companies involved in whatever role they play, it's to some extent always a loss of competence and control for the public sector, and with that, for the citizens, isn't it?
Well, certainly in terms of the administrative aspect of the municipality, and this is one of the biggest reasons why I say municipalities should not contract out is because you then lose that capacity. You certainly equipment and machinery and so on, but you also lose skills, administrative skills, technical skills, frontline worker skills. And those things are very difficult to get back. They're expensive, time consuming. And so, people in favor of contracting out will say, well, it's okay, we'll try it for 5 years or 10 years. But then at the end of that 10-year period, what are you left with? You're left with a giant hole, literally and figuratively in the ground, that is difficult to climb out of. And often it's combined with government austerity and so on. So then, having to figure out how you're going to find X number of millions or billions of dollars or euros to get back to where you were becomes difficult. So it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that privatization is the only way to do things because you strip the public sector of its capacity to do these things. And so this is another one of the reasons we've looked so much at remunicipalization and the struggles that municipalities have had to bring services back in-house. And most of the research has tended to focus on positive examples of this, where there have been success stories, Paris and Berlin and so on. But there are many, 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 an untold number because we don't really hear about them, of places that have tried to remunicipalize. And in part because they couldn't afford to do so, were not able to bring a service back in-house. And so, again, we get back to the financing question. Um, and even if it were to be publicly financed, there's often resistance to that. So it's a very risky road to go down, and I think 40 years into this water privatization experiment, we have enough evidence to suggest that even if it maybe is going to work for a while, there are invariably structural problems associated with it. So you're much better off putting your energy and resources into remaking and rebuilding a good, accountable, efficient public sector.
You mentioned Paris and Berlin remunicipalizing the water. There is quite a movement at the moment in Spain, in the Catalonia region also. The biggest disaster we see, I think, in the UK. How do you see the chances there that water gets back under public control and to reasonable functioning?
There's a very strong public movement and has been for a long time. It's been gaining ground largely because of we often talk about water, and I always try and intentionally say water and sanitation because they typically go together. They're usually under one roof and should be because it's sort of one comes in, the other goes out. But the sanitation thing doesn't often get as much attention. It's not as sexy to talk about poo as it is to talk about water. But it's the sanitation and literally the poo that's been attracting most of the attention in the UK with sewage spills and contaminated shorelines, et cetera. So, yeah, lots of interest in it, lots of anger, and it's not just water; it's other services that were privatized in the UK. The Probably the biggest hurdle there is the financial one. And because it was done at a national level, and because you've got such powerful multinational corporations in place, and because they've dug themselves into such an enormous debt situation, the financing question is a huge one. Now, previous Labor government had put together some policy documents on how they thought they could make this work, and in fact came to the conclusion that it wouldn't actually cost anything because these private companies weren't owed anything, given, the terrible services they provided and the returns on investment they've made, et cetera. You know, perhaps on paper, but you can imagine the legal fights that would ensue on that front. But figuring out how to pay for it is a huge problem. And I'll just plug a paper that I published last year, or the year before, in Urban Studies, called De-Financing Remunicipalization, where I actually look at the costs and opportunities for financing remunicipalization and how it can be an enormous barrier. And in fact, in Berlin, although it was a successful remunicipalization, it costs so much to do it that it's basically hamstrung the current public operator in terms of doing some of the more progressive things they wanted to do because of the costs of remunicipalization. So nobody knows what it would actually cost in the UK, or going through courts, what the final numbers would look like. But I suspect, the most important thing is having a party with the political will to push it through that has the political support. And so, the previous Labour government had the political will internally, but they didn't get the political support for it. So, those two things have to come together. There has to be enough anger and frustration amongst the public, combined with a political party that has the will and the commitment to pushing it through. But I think in my mind, there's no doubt that water and sanitation services need to be brought back in-house in the UK. But because it's just at that national scale, it's going to be much, much harder than doing it, in a single municipality.
Let's go back to Latin America that you mentioned already at the beginning. We see at the moment quite some strive for privatization in Argentina and in Brazil. They seem really to try to power it through in some places. On the other side, we see in the global south, but especially in Latin America, also the concept of public water being questioned by water justice organizations, as they are afraid that public water could mean state control, and they don't like state control. They don't want the state to control their water. They ask for community-run water. You mentioned that before, and community-controlled services for water and sanitation. Aren't they right, looking at the poor record of service provision and accountability of these states? Or what do you make out of that? You published on that on the past, and you had some personal experience also on that. What's your point on that today?
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment on your opening comment about Argentina and Brazil, sort of firing up the privatization debate again. It's not surprising in Argentina under Milei. It is surprising in Brazil under Lula that there's been so much momentum behind it. So I don't, and I'm not close enough to the ground to know those dynamics. But I continue to be surprised by the Lula government's, willingness, if not outright support for pushing privatization. On the bigger question of people being, concerned about the state, absolutely. Maybe I've mentioned to you previously when I was in Cochabamba in Bolivia a number of years ago, and talking to a room of water activists about remunicipalization, and somebody said to me, "Well, are you, talking about state control?" And I said, "Well, in general, yeah." And then half the room got up and left because they were like, "We're not interested in state control." Which, raises again the question of the meaning of public. And so, I think what it does is it certainly challenges that direct equivalency of state equals public. But then the question is, well, to what extent are people involved in the state? And is it enough to simply vote for a government that you then, hand control over to managing your public services? Or do you want more direct engagement in that kind of decision making? Or to the sort of extreme of that position, do you simply want no government and you want, community control? Now, that in the end involves some form of governance. You have to figure out how the community is going to run these things. So in a way, it is a government, but I won't get into those semantics. Um, but I completely understand the uh, distrust of municipal governments, not just in Latin America, in many parts of the world, because they have been corrupt. They have been unaccountable, and they have, used water in particular as a political weapon, to either shut it off in areas where they have opposition or to invest in areas where they have support. And so I completely understand the distrust of the state. Um, so, and in those cases, I think there's a valid, strong case to be made for building community capacity. And what does make Latin America perhaps not unique, but in a stronger position in this regard is that there is not just a long, but an ongoing tradition of water provision at the community level. And some of these are literally, centuries, if not millennially old. Some of them are more contemporary, but we've also done research on this, and this particularly in Colombia, there's a lot of really interesting community-led water types of services. So yeah, for me, that's a form of public service, as long as it's accountable and transparent and equitable, etc. So, in the same way that I would say you don't just celebrate a state-owned service because it's state-owned, you don't just celebrate a community-run service because it's community-run. They can also be very problematic. So, uh, but what I would say on a more general note is I don't see this as a kind of universal solution. There are places absolutely where not only does it work technically, but it works politically and socially and economically. There are lots of places where it will never work, and particularly in informal settlements in the Global South, which now house 1 in 3 people in the Global South. You don't have the kinds of traditional forms of doing things. You have a lot of fluidity in the communities. You don't necessarily have that kind of trust and long-term place building kinds of opportunities. So some people, I think, tend to sort of romanticize community-led water services. And that to me can be really problematic because you kind of let the state off the hook. And you say, oh, let communities can run these things when they just either can't or they won't be allowed to, or won't have the resources to do so. And it can also create highly unequal services. Water and sanitation, I've said it's not rocket science, it's fairly straightforward, but it's expensive to build a sewage treatment plant or to get water treatment facilities in place. And you have to have those basic treatment facilities in place. I mean, E. coli treats everybody the same, so you have to make sure you have safe water. Um, and so, to the extent that community-run water can provide safe, reliable water at scale, fantastic. But I think those examples are, in the grand scheme of things, on a global basis, those are relatively limited examples of things. Um, so I do, as I said, get a little nervous about people that tend to sort of run with this as if it's some kind of an ideal model. I think the best way to approach it is to say, hey, if this works in this place or could work in that place, fantastic. Let's give it support. And perhaps that's in combination with the state. And there's lots of examples of sort of co-production where communities and sometimes labor unions and municipal governments work together. But let's not romanticize it.
Living in a confederal state myself, where water is run by hundreds of municipality-owned water providers. I know it's a bit difficult to say where actually the state is because you have so many levels of state and of involvement of different forces. So definitely the setting makes a big difference. Um, Staying in Latin America for a moment again, especially in Mexico, there is a huge debate now about these so-called illegal connections. So a strong state campaign against water illegally tapped from the big domains. Millions of liters of water are taken from the mains without any, like with undeclared connections. Does the water belong to the state? And he can say, if you take it, it's illegal.
I mean, technically, sure. But these are desperate moves by desperate people. I mean, sometimes it's organized crime, and that's problematic because then you've got, organized criminals then preying on other people's desperation. And so that is adds another layer of complexity to it. When it comes to, individuals tapping into a water main or sometimes, electricity, etc., um, I completely understand that. I think it's a demonstration of the failure of the state to provide services in an equitable, affordable way. So to me, it's a symptom of a problem. It's not the source of the problem. And you're blaming the victim rather than blaming, the real source of the problem. So, um, uh, but it's something that can't be ignored, because it often creates water shortages for other people. And perhaps most problematically, it introduces points of contamination in water lines that can then make water unsafe for others. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be acknowledged and shouldn't be addressed, but address the problem, not the symptom.
Okay, then let's talk about the global water crisis for a moment. I mean, there is an acceleration of issues, of droughts, of floods, of polluted water. There is the whole debate, climate change and its impacts on the water cycle and the water crisis. Where do you see this going, and who should do what first to get out of this mess?
Wow, okay. I can talk about those other issues easily enough. I mean, that's obviously a much, much bigger question, uh, related not entirely, but certainly in large part to climate change. And where are we headed with this? I teach a course at my university. I'll just say I'm located at the very tail end of the Great Lakes in North America and the head of the St. Lawrence River. So this is where the Great Lakes drain out into the St. Lawrence River, where 21% of the world's surface fresh water is located. And I say to my students, you are so lucky. 21% of the world's surface fresh water is flowing by you. And what do you know about it? And there's this irony in places that are water rich where we don't pay enough attention to it and we don't care enough, we don't really care about it. And none of my students could tell me how much they pay for their water, because it's so cheap. And, that is a good thing, but it's also a problematic thing. And so I think education is really important, and making sure they understand, not, I'm talking here about my students, the complexities of it. So I take them to the sewage treatment plant and the water treatment plant. We eat fish from Lake Ontario. We talk about microplastics and shifts to biodiversity and the impacts of phosphorus in the water. Um, and I think that kind of thing, I hope anyways, makes them more water aware and understanding the way that the hydrological cycle is related to the hydrosocial cycle and the way that we live our lives. has a direct impact on this essential service of that we have, or essential resource. So now that's, it's one thing to say in a rich country with lots of water resources. I'm certainly not going to take on that preachy kind of tone in a water scarce country where somebody is, trying to survive, because again, they're not the problem. They're the symptom of the problem. It's predominantly a rich world. We are creating the problem in the rich world with our production of environmental bads that have created climate change and other pollutants in the water. And so I think we in the North have a responsibility on that front to deal with these things. Um, but also countries in the South need to figure out, ways of coping and strategies for, periods of drought and floods and so on. So, we need to both try and mitigate and slow down the rate of change with climate change and pollution, while at the same time figuring out how we're going to build infrastructure and patterns of consumption which can adapt to what appears to be a kind of fixed in place shift in our world. That's, well, it's fixed, it's unpredictable, but it's clear that we passed the point of no return with climate change. So how are we going to manage these things? And that's a much more complicated and multifaceted question than whether a public or a private company should run our water services. But it does, in my mind, underscore the need for public ownership and public management of these services, because private companies have no interest in thinking out 40, 50, 100 years. It just doesn't make sense to them. But this is a 40, 50, 100-year problem that we have. So the fact that these bigger questions are happening around water resources, I think underscores the need to have public ownership and public management of water and sanitation.
Yeah, unfortunately, the COP30 in Belém, Brazil was not really a big success. And anyway, wood was not really a big issue there. So looks like the problems are growing faster than the solutions at the moment. For yourself, give me a little bit of an outlook. What are you working on? What can we expect, some publications? What's coming up from your side?
Yeah. Well, I continue to do work on remunicipalization. In fact, I had a paper come out yesterday about the remunicipalization of water in Bordeaux, and I call it making water public in Bordeaux. And I, sort of raises this question about, well, yes, it was managed by a private company for the last 70 years, but it's now public. But what does that mean? So I think, I continue to explore this question of what is public, which was also part of a larger book I did a couple of years ago called Meanings of Public and the Future of Public Services. But the majority of my work for the last few years, and this is, I'm still in the thick of it, is around financing questions, and particularly public banks. And so these are typically state-owned banks, although again, the question of ownership can vary, but typically publicly owned and or publicly managed financial institutions, and specifically the role that they've played in investing in water and sanitation services. And so we did a special issue of a journal looking at public banks and public water in Europe a couple of years ago. And then earlier this year, we put out a book looking at public banks and public water services in the global south, which included case studies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So my colleagues right now, one of them is doing a collection on public banks and gender, the extent to which public banks take gender seriously in their lending and their activities. We're looking at a collection of public banking institutions in North America, and then I'm starting up some work on public banks and green finance and the extent to which public banks do things differently. A lot of this sort of green financing stuff has, in the private sector, banks and others have been accused of greenwashing. where they sell their financial instruments as being green, but really, if you pull back the layers, it's no different than anything else. So, to what extent do public banks do green financing differently? And here we see, again, the relationship to things like water and energy, where public banks are investing very heavily in the transitions to renewable energies, for example, more efficient ways of doing water and sanitation. So again, I'm not prejudging it, but we're picking public banks that we think have done a relatively good job of doing green finance in terms of, truly being green. But we always go in with a critical mind. We always want to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of different ways of doing public banking, and what are the lessons to be learned from that in different parts of the world. So yeah, the financing question is huge. And often, we tend to exclude finance from our definitions of public utilities. And for me, a public finance in general should be a public utility, like water and electricity, and public banks are public utilities. The world of finance seems to have carved out a niche for itself where they're somehow special or more complicated. But finance, like water, is not rocket science. You loan money to get things done in the most efficient and accountable ways possible. And that's what we're exploring, is how can public banks be accountable and sustainable and efficient in ways that are equity oriented. There are good examples out there.
Sounds exciting. I mean, living in Switzerland, all I know about the public aspect of Swiss banks is they are owned by Arab states, and we have to save them time by time with taxpayers' money. So you keep us informed about your research, about your publications. Looking forward to
Yeah.
see that.
Well, I mean, the Swiss banks are the epitome of the lack of transparency, right? So
Right. Definitely. Okay, let's slowly come to an end. Is there anything we should talk about, or you wanted to say we didn't touch at all, or you want to add on?
no, I mean, I could talk forever. So I think we've got a lot there. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, and we will publish the interview, and I hope we stay in touch and hear from you again. Thanks a lot for doing
Fantastic.
this.
Thanks,
Thank
Roland.
you, David. Goodbye. Thank you.